Sub-Dean undergraduates, Sub-Dean postgraduates, ably represented, though present, the head of Department of Political Science, heads of other departments, the acting faculty officer, the faculty librarian, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The 26th Faculty of the Social Sciences lecture will be delivered this evening by Dr. David Uchenna Enweremadu of the Department of Political Science. Dr. David Enweremadu was born in Lagos on the 30th of May 1973 to the family of Chief Samuel Enweremadu and Mrs. Augustina Enweremadu. He had his primary school education at Alaba Primary School in Ajeromi, Ifelodu local government area of Lagos between 1979 and 1985. He proceeded to Alakoto High School and later Mokoya High School, all in Lagos, for his secondary school education between 1985 and 1991. He was admitted to the University of Ibadan to study for a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science in the 1992-1993 academic session, which he completed with a second-class upper division in 1997. Upon completion of his NYSC, he enrolled for a master's degree in political science in the Department of Political Science, Ibadan, finishing top of his class in 2001. In 2002, he won a scholarship that was awarded by the Institute for French Research in Africa, IFRA, and funded by French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to study for a master's in political science during the 2002-2003 academic session at the famous Institute of Political Studies, Bordeaux, France, being a center of excellence in political studies at the University of Bordeaux. He completed the master's program in September 2003 with a PhD grade, which encouraged the government of France to award him further scholarship to pursue a PhD in political with specialization in politics and development in Africa and countries of the South. He completed his PhD in record time and with distinction in December 2006, despite writing his thesis in French language. Dr. Enweremadu began his academic career in February 2007 when he joined the French Institute for Research in Africa.
Bluetooth disconnected.
A research fellow, as a research fellow. In September 2007, he joined the University of Ibadan as lecturer 2 in the Department of Political Science, with specialization in public policy and administration, and rose through the ranks to attain his present position of a reader in October 2017. Dr. Enweremadu has held several administrative positions within and outside the university, including serving as chair on the Undergraduate Affairs Committee between 2011 and 2014. Sub-Dean Undergraduate Faculty of the Social Sciences between 2016 and 2018. Coordinator of MSc program in the Department of Political Science from 2018 to 2021, and served in postgraduate Faculty of the Social Sciences from August 1, 2021 till date. In the 2014-2015 session, while on sabbatical leave from UI, he worked as a research officer in planning, research and review department at the ICPC headquarters in Abuja, and later headed the research and publication department of the Anti-Corruption Academy of Nigeria, the training arm of the ICPC. The faculty lecturer is a member of the Nigerian Political Science Association, member African Political Science Association, fellow of the African Studies Center Leiden, and a senior fellow at the French Institute for Research in Africa. He is also a recipient of many local and international research grants and awards. Has participated in national and international conferences, workshops, and research projects. He has also consulted for a number of national and international organizations. He was at various times the Leventis Postgraduate Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, UK, visiting fellow at the African Studies Center, Leiden University, Netherlands, visiting researcher at the Durkheim Center for Comparative Politics and Sociology, University of Bordeaux, France, and visiting researchers to track development scholar at the Research Center of Society and Culture, Indonesia Institute of Science, Jakarta, Indonesia. He has published in several local and international high-impact journals. He has also authored or co-authored several books, including Anti-Corruption Campaign in Nigeria, The Politics of a Failed Reform, published by the ASC, Leiden University, in 2012. Dr. Enweremadu is happily married with promising children. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and honor to invite Dr. David Uchenna to deliver his faculty lecture. Entitled Corruption and Nigeria's Economic Development Debacle, Lessons from Indonesia. Dr. Enweremadu.
Of Social Sciences, other deans here present, heads of department, the sub-dean, undergraduates, sub-dean postgraduates, faculty officer, senior colleagues here present, colleagues from within and outside the University of Ibadan, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to present this 26th faculty lecture on behalf of the Department of Political Science. The faculty lecture series commenced in 1986 when the first lecture was delivered by late Professor G.F. Mbade of blessed memory on behalf of the Department of Economics. Subsequently, about 24 other faculty lectures have been delivered. Among them was the 1989 faculty lecture delivered by the then Dr. J.E.A. Ayoade, now Professor Emeritus, who examined federal practice in Nigeria. In 1912, we also had the then Dr. P.O. Obi Simolisi, now Professor Obi Simolisi, which focused on the spiritual dimension of human and national security. Then, Dr. Aituaje Pogosi, now Professor Pogosi, delivered in 2018 on the topic "A World Without Form: Issues in Multilateralism." Today's lecture, the 26th faculty lecture, I will be discussing a different topic. As has been announced earlier, I'll be speaking on corruption and Nigeria's economic development, two concepts which are among the most debated issues in contemporary Nigeria. Mr. Dibsa, since the years following her political independence in 1960 from Britain, Nigeria's leaders have adopted and pursued a variety of economic development policies and programs, all of which have failed, unfortunately, to translate into sustainable economic development. Indeed, Nigeria's failure to kickstart any meaningful economic development projects, despite abundant resources and multiple development plans, has long been a source of policy and intellectual debates. Why have other nations at comparable stages of development and independence and with fewer resources witnessed significant transformation? Why Nigeria's economy and human development
Bluetooth disconnected.
stagnated or even declined?
Bluetooth connected.
While most opinions agreed that an alternative development strategy was required to bring about a change, there was and still is hardly any form of consensus regarding what constitutes this alternative development strategy, or even the actual causes of Nigeria's predicament. Consequently, a wide variety of explanations have been offered by political economists and development scholars to explain Nigeria's poor economic performance. These explanations fall into four categories of viewpoints. The first one is what is known as the old cause or paradox of plenty, where abundant resources, in the case of Nigeria, oil and natural gas, breeds widespread rent sinking that makes development difficult. I said Carey, Calteri, 1997, Stella Martin, and Sobremeyer. Second viewpoint, a deeply fragmented political system and long history of political instability arising from the absence of a securely dominant ethno-religious group, durable political consensus, and strong centralized states, ensuring that the political calculation of each regime is shaped by the short-term exigencies of regime survival. Third viewpoint, the habitual adoption of bad economic policies, Coulier, Bevan, DBA, and others. Finally, and the effect of decades of widespread corruption and weak governance, so institutions. These are some of the arguments political economists have preferred to explain why Nigeria have refused to develop. Now, the empirical validity of the first three explanations appears not to be in contention. However, the issue of corruption and its role in Nigeria's development has become a puzzle, so to speak. On the one hand, only a few people who are familiar with Nigeria's development, including most of us sitting here, will deny that corruption is a key issue in any explanation of Nigeria's development challenges or problems. However, the view that corruption is responsible for Nigeria's slow economic development suffers from some obvious empirical problems. While the majority of poor countries have tended to exhibit high levels of corruption, examples are African states, there are still other states that have witnessed rapid transformation despite tolerating high incidences of corruption. And then many Asian countries like South Korea, China, India, and notably Indonesia fit into this category of what some scholars like Claire describes as enrichment with growth. If this postulation is true, then how can corruption be held responsible for Nigeria's poor economic development record if so many countries who have high incidence of corruption have managed to record rapid economic development? Why would we say corruption is responsible for Nigeria's poor economic development record? The diverging experiences of Nigeria and Indonesia, which is the subject of today's lecture, have attracted more interest. So many scholars have emphasized the fact that Nigeria and Indonesia both experience similar levels of corruption, making it difficult to sustain the hypothesis that corruption is a significant factor in Nigeria's underdevelopment. What is, however, not very clear is whether Nigeria and Indonesia experienced corruption exactly in the same way. For it is when we can show that both countries have experienced corruption in exactly the same way that we can make a categorical statement that corruption is inconsequential in explaining development in these two countries. In my view, it is important to first examine, I think, the similarity and specificity of corruption in each country before anyone can make a categorical statement about the possible linkages to economic development or even economic growth. The major objective of today's lecture is therefore to interrogate using insights from existing scholarly works and primary data which I collected from both countries. The experiences of these two countries with corruption and then their possible role in fostering different levels of economic development. For the purpose of this lecture, I have decided to measure economic development in terms of changes in economic growth, GDP, income per capita, and poverty rates. These are not the only measures of economic development, but they are among the most important. And I argue that no country achieves rapid economic development without changes in these three variables. In doing this, I am not suggesting that other explanations for economic development outcomes are not tenable. One must recognize the fact that even though a very crucial factor, corruption alone could not have been the sole or even the most important cause of divergence in the development history of Nigeria and Indonesia. Some other studies have focused on other variables, for instance, the role of elites and the role of economic policy. Some have focused on demography, population policy, some have looked at trade, foreign trade, some have also looked at foreign aid. In terms of my research, I have utilized two methods for data collection. One was the library-based research, and the second was in-depth interview with carefully selected stakeholders, both in Nigeria as well as in Indonesia. Let me look briefly at the literature. When I look into the literature of corruption and economic development, there are few assumptions that can be made. Now, corruption has generally occupied a central position in academic and policy discussions, especially those focusing on economic development in the third world. In general, the consensus emerging from these debates has been that corruption in all its forms is a serious obstacle to economic growth and development. Only few studies have attempted to argue that corruption facilitates economic development in any way. Most scholars or most writings have told us that corruption is an obstacle to development. But there are few scholars who have tried to argue otherwise. Lev, in 1989, published an article which was titled Economic Development Through Bureaucratic Corruption. And that article Lev showed that in some contexts, especially in developing countries, corruption can be a positive factor. It can facilitate development. For example, it can serve as a grease oil that oils the wheel of bureaucracy in places where bureaucracies will otherwise be inefficient and slow. Huntington, a very famous political scientist, also supports this view. In his work, Corruption and Modernization, he argues that in countries experiencing rapid modernization, corruption can sometimes be a positive factor. For example, this is my own example. Huntington did not use this example. If you deal with the police in countries like Nigeria, payment of bribe to police can open the door for work efficiency. So Huntington is saying that in such countries like Nigeria, some bribes are positive because they lead to efficient bureaucracy. To a large extent, however, the perception of corruption as a key factor militating against development stems from the strong correlation which is often observed between corrupt and underdeveloped states in cross-national surveys. Many cross-national surveys usually show that there is a correlation between corrupt states and underdeveloped states. States that are corrupt, very corrupt, are also usually states that are underdeveloped. For instance, if you look at the Corruption Perception Index published yearly by the Transparency International and the World Development Indicators by the World Bank, you will see that the least developed states on earth are also the most corrupt states. Now, a lot of people have expressed misgivings about these cross-national surveys. Some argue that their methodology is problematic. Some say there are ideological underpinnings. But by and large, the idea of a strong negative relationship between corruption and economic development has remained the dominant one and continues to define global thinking about development in the present decade. The assumed negative effect of corruption on development is premised on two fundamental grounds. The first one is that a high level of corruption leads to slower economic growth, which is a necessary precondition for economic development. And we have many authors like Moro who have championed this view. The second ground is that even if rapid growth was to occur in corrupt countries, corrupt regimes will be unable to translate economic growth into tangible benefits due to a possible misallocation of funds. That is to say, in some instances, a corrupt country can experience rapid growth, maybe in the short term. But even when that happens, they will still not be able to transform that growth into economic development because corrupt regimes will mismanage growth. In other words, you can have growth without development. In theoretical terms, therefore, the view that corruption is incompatible with development sounds quite convincing, is it not? The problem is that some Empirical evidences do not support that conclusion. As I've already noted, Indonesia did not only experience rapid growth, but was also able to transform or translate that growth to development, measured in terms of GDP growth, income per capita, and declining poverty rate. That is despite the country's high level of corruption. Indeed, in Indonesia, there was this belief that corruption had facilitated economic growth and development. It was, for instance, widely seen to provide an incentive for many actors to perform their roles in several other contexts. In one specific context, it was assumed that it helped to reduce delay within the bureaucracy, helping to support development projects. This therefore supports the argument of left and quantity. But while some scholars have tried to explain why corrupt states are in general more likely to grow slowly than less corrupt states, we have only very few who have bothered to investigate why states like Indonesia, with high level corruption, will still experience rapid economic growth. Worse still, even the findings of these few studies have not gained sufficient recognition. First, many reasons account for this. First one is that many people who read these studies, that is, those studies that try to show why corrupt states can achieve economic development, will say there is a difference between economic growth and economic development, and they will conclude that those studies are talking about economic growth, so we are not interested in economic growth. We are interested in economic development. This is one reason for dismissing those studies. Second, and more seriously also, some of these studies, they're comparative in nature. We always pick countries that are not the best case studies. For instance, you are looking at the effect of corruption on development, and you have picked China and Indonesia. These are two countries that have high level corruption, but also have high level economic development. So the comparison will not serve. Instead, why not pick countries that have the same level of corruption, but their development outcome is different? Some authors have simply focused on one variable. Those that even pick two countries that are good comparative cases will end up focusing on one study. Zingzag, for instance, was interested in South Korea and Nigeria, but studied only one factor, one variable, so ignored other factors that were also important. Mr. Disa, at this junction, I think it will be necessary for me to say a few words about the historical basis for comparing Nigeria and Indonesia, and even my participation in this exercise. Why Nigeria and Indonesia? I know many people in this hall will wonder. Are there no other cases that you could have chosen? The idea came in 2006 when the government of Netherlands, one of the leading donor countries in the world, decided to initiate and finance a study on development, a comparative study on development, which included several scholars from the West, America and Europe, and of course Africa and Asian researchers. And I happen to be one of those scholars from Africa who participated in this study. The central objective of the research, which was tagged Tracking Development Research, was to answer one basic question: why have sub-Saharan African countries refused to become richer? Why have African countries refused to become richer despite receiving billions in aid? Why countries in Asia have grown richer? Now, to cut the long story short, at the end of the project, these researchers, majority of them, concluded that the problem was with economic policy, while the Southeast Asian countries, which we regard as the Asian tigers, were focusing on policies like massive investment in agriculture, macroeconomic stability, and rural investment in rural areas. They call it pro-rural spending. African countries did not do that, they did otherwise. And they argue that this is the reason why you have divergence in development between Asia and Africa. Now, as a member of this panel, of this committee, I did not disagree with them, but I only argue that a monocausal explanation will not stand, will not be okay. That there is something, because we also studied corruption and so many other variables before coming to the conclusion that it's economic policy. And the argument they make, which is what I have said earlier, Indonesia and Nigeria suffer the same corruption. So Indonesia developed and Nigeria did not develop, which means corruption is not the issue. Right? I said, no, there is something about the corruption in Indonesia and Nigeria which we need to understand. So in order to satisfy my curiosity, I sought for a grant and went to Indonesia in 2010 to study the problem further. And the result of my research is what I am presenting today. First, I will do this at 3 levels. I will compare the seriousness of corruption in Nigeria and Indonesia to first establish whether both countries are actually as corrupt as we say they are. At the second level, I will look at divergence in the economic performance. And finally, I will now look at the role of corruption in explaining that divergence. So how corrupt, seriousness of corruption, how corrupt was Indonesia, especially under Suharto? The Tracking Development Project, which I spoke earlier, focused on a given period, 1966, 67, up to 1998. Now, from 1966, 67 to 1998, Indonesia had one dictator, General Suharto. Now, how did Suharto's Indonesia compare with the situation in Nigeria as far as corruption is concerned? Now, we find that during this period, Indonesia and Nigeria actually exhibited the same level of corruption. The only difference was that in Indonesia, one man was in power throughout the 32 years. And then in Nigeria, we have succession of dictators. Otherwise, there was no difference as far as levels of corruption is concerned. You can look at the table. Much later, it will be displayed. Now, in Indonesia, to start with, corruption was a major legacy of Suharto. And indeed, one of the main reasons why the people turned against him in 1998 when he lost power. As many researchers have shown, corruption was extremely pervasive. At the bottom of the pyramid, petty officials stole regulatory amounts, while at the top, the theft was egregious. In the early stages of Suharto's rule, his wife, First Lady Ibu Tien Suharto, was renamed or was nicknamed Ibu Tien Pusong, which in the Indonesian language translated to Ibu 10%. This referred to the amount of money that she regularly collects from contracts. By the middle of the 90s, this First Lady has been renamed Ibu 50-50, which indicated that her share has increased considerably. Now, Suharto and his wife were not the only corrupt people. His 6 children other relatives, business associates also participated in the corruption. These individuals were routinely granted state monopolies over commodity sales, exclusive supply contracts, special tax breaks, and etc., with which they were able to corner very large sums of resources. These practices enable Suharto and his allies inside and outside the government to venture into and gain commanding positions in the key sectors of the economy, including cement and petrochemical. In 2003, the World Bank has already concluded that under Suharto, the legacy of his regime was weak and corrupt institutions, and a culture of favours, nepotism, and collusion in business elites. Indeed, so rampant were these practices that corruption, collusive, nepotism, KKN, which means in English corruption, collusion, and nepotism, became one of the most powerful slogans in the attack on President Suharto and his New Order regime, culminating eventually in his fall in May 1998. So the magnitude of corruption in Indonesia can just be best imagined. Now, in May 1999, Time Asia report estimated Suharto's fortune to be around $15 billion, personal fortune. This excluded corporate assets, shares, real estate, etc. This is just cash. According to that magazine, the family who controls about 36,000 square kilometers of land, real estate. These estimates were also confirmed by Transparency International when it published the list of corrupt leaders, 10 corrupt leaders. Suharto was number 1 on that list. Our own General Abacha was about number 4. Therefore, it was not surprising that after Suharto's fall, he faced multiple charges of corruption and abuse of forces. At the end, Suharto was never jailed, personally convicted because of old age and illness, although his companies, foundations were all convicted. But what is important here is to see that the record of corruption under Suharto. Now I come to Nigeria, and I will not dwell much on this because all of us seated here are Nigeria. We are already too familiar with Nigerian experience. Just to reiterate that Nigeria's record in corruption is not different from Indonesia. The only thing that we were led by a succession of military dictators who raped the country's resources. Now, whether military or civilian. And the best example of this is the Babangida and Abacha administration. Let us look at the table 2. We can see the statistics from Transparency International comparing corruption levels in Nigeria and Indonesia. And what it shows is that there is a lot of similarities. In fact, when you go to Indonesia in those days, there was an argument between, they usually have this argument, which country is more corrupt? They believe their country is more corrupt than Nigeria. But sometimes transparencies publish data showing that is either Indonesia this year, Nigeria next year. We look now at economic performance in Nigeria. From the foregoing analysis, it is clear that Indonesia and Nigeria have seriously emerged in corruption throughout the time under study. And both countries regularly occupy the topmost position in all these measures of corruption. But notwithstanding their common experience with corruption, economic performance in Nigeria and Indonesia did diverge very sharply. This divergence became more prominent, pronounced in the late 70s and 80s. At the time Nigeria and Indonesia started the journey to independence in the 60s, the statistics show that Nigeria was much better economically. But by the time we go to the 70s and 80s, the divergence started. From the Suharto's era, you could see that those three indicators of economic development talked about earlier were strong. GDP growth rate over the 30 years period was average of 7%, that is Indonesia. Poverty rate declined from 70% in the mid-60s to a mere 11% in 1996. Now, when you come to Nigeria, compare this to Nigeria, what do you have? Nigeria was characterized by weak economic growth. The highest growth rate, the average growth rate in Nigeria for the same period was about 3.3%. And this was similar to our population growth, which means there was really no growth. If you look at poverty figures, in 1970, poverty rate in Nigeria was 35%. Don't forget that in Indonesia it was 70% poverty rate. But by 1999, what was poverty rate in Nigeria? 70%. It has moved from 35% to 70%. If you look at figures on per capita income, you see the same trend. In 1966, Indonesia started with $53 as per capita income. This increased to $1,100 in 1996. And to date, the most recent figure, 2021, it stands at about $44,300. For Nigeria, in the mid-60s, we had a per capita income of $100, higher than Indonesia. But in 1996, it was just $460. And today, in 2021, Nigeria's per capita income is $2,066, less than half of Indonesia. Now, let's look at corruption as explanation for divergent economic performance. A close reading of Nigeria's corruption and development history, as I have presented, leads us to pose two pertinent questions about the validity of the often restated thesis of a negative role of corruption in economic development. First, if indeed corruption levels are very high in Indonesia and the country still managed to produce such impressive rate of economic development, can corruption still be an explanation for underdevelopment in Nigeria? Secondly, if we say the level of corruption is not the problem, what then is the problem? What then can explain our divergence in economic development? As I have said earlier, although several studies have pointed to a link between corruption and development, there is no consensus on this issue. On the one hand, most comparative studies will say Nigeria and Indonesia have experienced the same level of corruption. So what? Corruption is not explanation. But there are also theoretical literature that have said and shown that there is a link between corruption and development. So this is also the perspective that most of us in Nigeria share. We all believe, or most of us believe, that corruption is responsible for our underdevelopment. So my research was based on the assumption that this kind of debate can only be solved by re-engaging the issue in a different way, which is what I've chosen to do in my study. The argument of whether both countries experience the same corruption and what is its implication for development needs to be re-examined. In doing this, as an anti-corruption scholar, I have just isolated corruption. Like I said earlier, I do not argue that there are no other factors at play, but my purpose is to show that it is possible for a country to be very corrupt and achieve rapid economic development. So we will see why. So in the course of my study, I try to answer two principal questions. First, Was Indonesia's corruption substantially different from the Nigerian brand? Not level of corruption, but type of corruption, form. If yes, can these differences help us explain the diverging economic development we see? So my findings, Mr. D, confirm that indeed these two countries have experienced different forms of corruption, and that these differences in forms of corruption is to a large extent responsible for the divergence in economic development. I go to the first factor or first explanation: differences in form of corruption. So the first step I took was to establish whether there are differences between Nigeria and Indonesia as far as their experience in corruption was concerned. And to do this, I first went to the literature of corruption. What has the literature of corruption to tell us about differences in forms of corruption? And indeed, what I see is that, or what I found was that the literature of corruption has already made that point, that there can be differences in forms of corruption which different countries experience. And these differences hold the key. We can explain differences in development. Now this argument was popularized first by Schleifer and Beachley in 1993, when they argued that there is a difference between centralized and decentralized forms of corruption. And then they said the last one, the decentralized, was less compatible with development. Other scholars have also followed suit, Mark Clinton, using the terms organized versus disorganized form of corruption. Along the same line, Lambsdorff makes a distinction between grand and petit corruption. Petit corruption also means small corruption, arguing that investors have preference for grand corruption. They prefer grand corruption than small corruption. Similarly, authors like Bach have used the term regulated versus non-regulated predatory neo-patrimonialism. Some corruption can be regulated, some places they are not regulated. And finally, I have Zinzeg, who talks about what she calls neo-patrimonialism and chronism. And she says neo-patrimonialism is the one you see in Africa, while chronism is what you see in Asia. They are both corruption, but they are different types of corruption. Now, let's now apply these differences to Nigeria and Indonesia and see how they fit in, how these two countries fit in. Indonesia under Suharto, we found that what you have was a neo-patrimonial state, quite all right, but at the same time, it was a centralized state and stable state. It was centralized and stable. For this reason, corruption was predictable in nature. Now, I've already described in any part of this lecture how Suharto profited from grand corruption, along with his family members, business, and political allies. While Suharto was more focused on grand corruption, corruption involving large sums, he was not totally uninterested in petty corruption. In other words, petty corruption was not beyond his control. What happened was that not all forms of petty corruption was allowed under Suharto. Some were permitted, others were disallowed. For instance, 10 to 15% commission on contracts can be allowed, depending on so many other factors. Now, one rule that operated under Suharto, according to economics professor Henry Kunkoro, was the idea of employing petty corruption as a bonus for development and a government project. In other words, you can say when corruption occurs in a project, but the project meets specific targets, the corruption can be allowed. In other words, whether or not a particular form of petty corruption was allowed depended on its perceived effect on development. To maintain tight control, Soweto did not rely on high pay for officials as many anti-corruption campaigners would expect. Officials were simply put in check, routine administrative check. Now, in terms of their outward manifestation, both the grand corruption and the petty corruption were less visible under Soweto than what obtains in other countries such as Nigeria. This and of course the notion of a centralized corruption have led many observers to incorrectly suggest that under Soweto, corruption was only allowed to a selected few. This is not correct. The notion of a centralized corruption does not in any way imply that Soweto allowed only few people to access corruption. Rather, what happened was that Soweto determined those who have access to corruption, when and how, that is, to what extent. Thus, as Soweto used his position as head of government at the national level to bestow privileges on selected few people, firms, cronies, family members, at the highest level, so he effectively awarded franchises to other government officials at lower levels to act in like mind, to act similarly. In other words, under Soweto, the structures of corruption was well defined. Most of those officials who participated in the system did not act independently of each other, but rather were organized into what would be regarded as well-organized network of franchises. This franchise was a disciplined arrangement that was governed by well-defined rules and norms. As Mark Leon observed, the entire system was designed precisely to attract and recruit people who were willing to play according to Soweto's rules. But the question you will ask is, why will Soweto go out of its way to construct this kind of organized corruption system? Because he didn't meet it there. He was the one who built it. There must be a reason for that. He must have derived benefits. These franchises were not allowed or awarded to officials free of charge. There was something they have to pay back in return. So Soweto drew enormous benefits from the franchise. These benefits come in many ways. Sometimes the franchisees will award contracts to family members of Soweto, friends. Sometimes offer them positions in company boards. These are rewards. And then support the regime, especially when it comes under attack from the public. Now, as it turned out, the system proved very successful and very durable in two ways. First, it was durable. That's the first measure of success. It lasted all the 32 years Soweto was in power. And it was only when events like the increasing greed of his grown children, when his children grew and became very venal, and then you had the outbreak of the Asian financial crisis, all combined together to discredit Soweto regime. That was when he fell. Otherwise, the system was durable. Second, and more importantly, this arrangement, which is where I am going, this arrangement minimized, if not totally eliminated, the feeling of uncertainty that corruption usually brings on the part of businesses, investors. Because what we saw was there was a large flock of investments to Indonesia, local and foreign, leading to rapid economic growth. The Indonesian experience therefore confirms the argument of some scholars who argue already that investors are more likely to be detained by petty, unpredictable corruption. Whereas grand and predictable corruption may not discourage them. This is especially so when you are dealing with a country with abundant natural resources. The positive impact of corruption on investment in Indonesia occurred because The operation of SWATO's centralized corruption system or system of patronage distribution implies that the cost usually associated with corruption, because corruption brings some cost, bribery, red tapeism, that is slowness of the bureaucracy, could be predicted and calculated as part of transaction costs by businesses. Under that arrangement, once a firm pays the bribe to the central authorities, SWATO himself or any of his ministers, it will be that business will be free from any further harassment from lower level officials. Indeed, SWATO himself was in the habit of collecting bribes from investors in exchange for guarantees of protection from venal local officials. In other cases, these investors will just offer lucrative company positions to members of the family, that is the first family, or their cronies, who will in return assist them to ward off any potential harassment from lower officials. In the end, bribe giving and taking became more coordinated. This is why this system is also referred to as one-stop shopping. If you pay somewhere, you are not paying again. One-stop shopping. When explaining widespread corruption in Indonesia did not discourage foreign investors, it is very important to also note that SWATO's administration, which they also call the New Order Regime, also was well known for emphasizing macroeconomic stability, using a variety of policy and institutional mechanisms which were tightly enforced throughout his regime by a small group of very influential technocrats, popularly known as Dabacle Mafia. In the history of Indonesia, beginning from the 60s, a lot of American foundations gave scholarship to Indonesians to go to the US, mostly the University of California, studied demography, agriculture, especially economics. Now, most of these people came back after their doctorate degree to constitute what they call the the mafia in Indonesia, which SWATO recruited and gave the responsibility of managing the economic policy. So SWATO was very, very conscious of macroeconomic policies. It was not just about corruption, but these technocrats ensured that patrimonial practices, bribe giving and taking, went along with the implementation of macroeconomic policies, which combined the distribution of patronage with a set of clearly identified public policy. So, at the end of the day, corruption cannot affect growth. To give one example, Indonesia is a Muslim country, but under SWATO, if you are a public appointee, you don't take a second wife. If you do that, you resign. You also, as an Indonesian person, everybody knows the policy of the government was to give aid to people who have 2 kids. The idea was from demographers in that think tank, who suggested that economic growth cannot be possible where there is uncontrolled population growth. So these are policies that SWATO enforced their economic policies tightly through this think tank, which they call the Dabacle Mafia. Now I come to Nigeria, and I'll do that quickly before I conclude. My time is up. What we found was the exact opposite of what you see in Indonesia. When compared to SWATO's Indonesia, the system we have in Nigeria throughout military rule was a decentralized, non-regulated, or predatory form of corruption. This is reflected more in the decentralized political system and culture in place in Nigeria. Now, historically, Nigeria came as a fragmented political system right from the beginning. But in the years following the Civil War, this already high level of fragmentation was further deepened as successful military leaders in Nigeria were of the need to appoint coups and possibly national disintegration resulted to routine state and local government creation to increase access to national aid for the increasing resting political elites at the regional and local level. Now, frequent creation of state and local councils was capped with a specific formula for distribution of revenue among federating states and councils. And the institutionalization of the federal character all provided opportunities to spread not only development to previously inaccessible regions, but to also encourage excessive corruption and rent seeking. This process has been termed the boomerang effect of Nigerian federalism. The emergence of this new state local government was further compounded by the creation of hundreds of national agencies and enterprises, commission, etc., which provided additional sources of patronage for loyalists of those in power, as well as potential troublemakers. Frequent changes of government was also witnessed in Nigeria. This never happened in Indonesia. As a result of inter-elite struggle for power, what then happened was these frequent changes of government encouraged political leaders to be short-sighted in their calculations and to place their survival above the exigencies of national development. For instance, officials fearing that their stay in office could be cut off at very short notice, were encouraged to see what they could as fast as they could. In other words, the structure of corruption in Nigeria is disorganized. And this is not only informed by decentralized institutional framework in place, but also the country's notoriously volatile political atmosphere, punctuated by violent and religious competition for power. Now, the cumulative effect of this is not very hard to see. The number of officials demanding for bribes and other forms of payoff was limitless. The more levels of government you have, the more the number of people demanding for bribes and payoff, resulting in the kind of free-for-all looting. This is what is also called overgrazing the common, where officials are unable to coordinate their bribe-taking behaviors, therefore creating an environment of unpredictability for business. This is the exact opposite of what we saw in Indonesia. In this system, there was not only an unparalleled capacity to institutionalize kleptocracy at every level of the social pyramid. Central leaders in Nigeria displayed unwillingness or incapacity to control the behavior of their subordinates, including lower level officials who routinely demanded for bribes and engaged in extortion without fear. To make matters worse, Nigerians did not prioritize macroeconomic stability, as we saw in Indonesia. So inflation, exchange rate, national expenditure, everything was always in turbulence. The result of this was obviously that outside the oil sector, Nigeria could not attract much foreign investments, and this led to slow economic growth. Where you have rampant or uncontrolled bribery and extortion, especially when you have also macroeconomic instability, foreign investors will run away. Now, from the foregoing analysis, it's clear that the secret of Indonesia's superior development was that Suharto, very unlike Nigeria, ran a centralized corrupt system and took a long-term view in its rent-seeking behavior, reasoning that investment in infrastructure and business-friendly policies was essential for sustained economic growth and continued uninterrupted flow of rent, and consequently its hold on power. Now, the differential approaches of the Nigerian and the Indonesian can be likened to what Orson's 2000 called stationary bandits versus roving bandits. The former, that is the stationary bandits, are those rulers who remain or have the expectation of remaining in power for a long time, and so they have the incentive to invest in structures that can produce long-term growth or benefits, rent, while the latter, the roving bandits, the Nigerians, consist of those rulers who operate in a highly unstable environment and so are guided by short-term calculations. Now, if we borrow Watson's postulation, we can just say, as Henley has argued, the uncontested sway of Suharto over a period of 32 years has made him a stationary bandit. While a predatory ruler, he has national interest in promoting national growth. While on the other hand, the Nigerians, roving bandits, who saw themselves as being in power for a short time, their short spell in power encouraged them to rape and run. The second factor I will conclude with this, because I mentioned that there are two factors which explain why corruption has diverging impact on Nigeria. It has to do with location and methods of investing proceeds of corruption. Apart from the form of corruption, centralized versus decentralized, we also have a difference when it comes to how people invested the proceeds of corruption. In Indonesia, typically the policy was you can steal, but you must keep the money inside Indonesia. And Suharto was able to control this. Again, the question is how did he manage to prevent money from going out? Because the literature tells us that it is the presence of financial havens, secrecy jurisdictions, that encourage people to transfer goods abroad. But the experience of Indonesia confirms that it's not true. In Indonesia is just a few kilometers away from Singapore, a notable safe haven. But here, Indonesians believe in investing their money inside Indonesia. The simple explanation was that they thought that there were better investment opportunities in Indonesia. Note that Suharto has been able to create a stable political and economic environment. So why do you take money outside? And in any case, there was no vindictive anti-corruption project like in Nigeria. So nobody is coming after your money. So Indonesia has responded by investing massively in their country. Not only did they keep their money in the country, they also invested in productive growth-generating ventures, agriculture, manufacturing, and other things. Unlike the Nigerians who store their money in farms, in their bedrooms, or when they want to keep, otherwise they keep it in banks or buy palatial homes. Mr. Adisa, the lesson from this discussion is that the assumption that all forms of corruption and its manifestations are harmful to development is not very correct. And unfortunately, this has led many government and non-governmental bodies to adopt anti-corruption policies and positions that are either unrealistic or necessary. Looking at Indonesia and Nigeria, it is clear that while corruption is harmful to economic development, at least theoretically, and therefore should be discouraged, its effects can be mitigated by reducing the political and business uncertainty that comes with a disorganized corruption, and encouraging public officials and local businessmen to begin to invest their money within their country in productive sectors. My teacher, with your permission, kind permission, I would like to say a few words of acknowledgement. First, I'd like to sincerely thank the Department of Political Science, my primary constituency, for making this lecture a reality. I want to specifically thank the head of the department and first female professor of political science in Debacle. and encouraging me to deliver this 26th faculty lecture on behalf of the Department of Political Science. I am immensely grateful to all my teachers, some of them are here, and colleagues in the Department of Political Science. I want to acknowledge, without following any particular order, the following intellectual fathers: Professor Emeritus J.A.A. Enweremadu, Professor J. Adekaye, Professor A. Agboega, Professor C. Adeniran, Professor A. Late Professor A. Amuru, late Professor L. Ikpebu, late Professor F. Oyosiri, late Dr. B.O. Adebisi. I would also like to acknowledge Professor F. Otubanjo, Professor E. Osagai, Professor A.A. or A.A.B. Agbaje, Professor A. Okunwade, Professor O.B.C. Molise, Professor B.A. Isumana. These are my intellectual fathers. I also like to acknowledge Professor E.R. Ayede, Head of the Department of Science, Professor D.A. Yagoyadu, let me also appreciate Dr. J.O. Arumusegbe, Dr. O. Akanji, Dr. A. Afewa, Dr. E.U. Idachaba, and Dr. G. Darren. And also all the non-teaching staff in the Department of Political Science, too many to remember, for their encouragement and support over the years, which has made this lecture possible. I wish to appreciate all the heads of departments here present or represented, the faculty, including Professor Ibidu Adeleko, represented by Professor E.G. Ajayi, Professor O.A. Adejumo, Head of Psychology, also represented by Dr. Shenge, Professor Shenge, sorry, Dr. Olufuke Fayomu, Department of Psychology, and all their staff for their support and encouragement. My immense gratitude and deep appreciation also due to the Dean, the able Dean of the Faculty of Political Science. And the faculty, the faculty officer, and all their staff. I'd like to immensely thank Professor Olutayo of the Department of Sociology and Professor O.O. Arefayo, the Department of Economics, respectively, for helping to read through an earlier draft of this lecture and making very important corrections and suggestions, which have improved the quality of the lecture. I'd like to recognize and thank my friends and colleagues from outside and within the Faculty of the Social Sciences. I thank my students who are here present. I'm grateful to all of you. I want to thank especially my mentor and secondary school teacher who walked in the middle of this lecture. And I want to say that if you want to know my history, you can see him. Mr. in the Oyo State House of Assembly Commission. I thank you very much, sir, for coming. I'm also grateful to all members of the Tracking Development Project who gave valuable time, information, and materials during my fieldwork, especially in Indonesia. I must thank the Research Center for Society and Culture in the Indonesia Institute of Sciences in Jakarta, who welcomed me and provided conducive research environment. Most especially, I thank the African Studies Center, Leiden University, Netherlands, and indeed the government of Netherlands, who provided substantial funding for this project. I appreciate the entire Enweremadu family. Unfortunately, they were unable to be here today, including my parents, David Uchenna Enweremadu, and Mrs. Uchenna Enweremadu. My siblings, my wife, my children, all members of my extended family, I appreciate all of you who have provided all care and love that sustained me throughout many years of my academic journey. Finally, I give thanks to God Almighty for making this lecture. Thank you for listening.